Well, hey there, it's that coding guy here. Today, I'm going to kick off a series on building your first API. So if you know a bit of Java and you've always wanted to build an API, but you were not sure where to get started, this series is going to be for you. As a newcomer, trying to get started building one of these from scratch can be mystifying and very frustrating. So what I've done is created a GitHub repository and a very simple foundational project that we can at least start with, get off the ground, talk about some different things, and start adding features as we go. I'm a role-playing geek, so the theme for this is going to be a random dungeon generator for a tabletop role-playing game. So that's what we'll do here. If you're familiar with Git, awesome. You can certainly get started and clone this down right away. If you're not familiar with Git, I would recommend getting familiar pretty quickly. But worst case scenario, you can download this zip file and get started with your favorite IDE there. In order to fully get this off the ground with me as we code along, you're going to need Postgres locally installed and running on port 5432, but we can configure exactly what port we're using. I'd recommend installing pgadmin 4. That is basically a graphical user interface that's going to allow us to take a peek at what's in the database in a graphical way, which can be pretty helpful. You're going to need the JDK 17, and I recommend JetBrains IntelliJ Community Edition. I really like IntelliJ, but you can use whatever IDE you like. And I also recommend Postman whenever you're developing any sort of API. It's basically the de facto standard tool to help us test our code and make sure it's running correctly. So if you've got those guys, awesome. So here we are. I've got the project opened in IntelliJ, and it looks a little weird. I've got this open in presentation mode right now so that the menus are nice and big and you can really see what I'm talking about. On the right hand side, I've got this Maven window open, and I found that by going to Tools, View Tool Windows, and came down to Maven. In the regular mode, it's also hanging out over here on the right hand side. Once you open this up, you want to go ahead and do this circle reload all Maven projects, and we'll talk about what that does here in a second. There's a whole bunch of stuff here in our tree that we don't really need to worry about. We're only going to be focused on a couple of different areas. One of them is the POM XML. The POM XML is the basic configuration for a Maven project, which is basically a dependency management tool. And this describes in XML all of the things that this project needs in order to run. You'll see that we've got a dependencies node here, and we've got the SpringBoot starter web, starter data JPA. We've got a Postgres driver here that's going to help us connect to our database, and the starter test. And all of these things are going to help us get this off the ground. Now, you shouldn't have to mess with this too much, as long as you've got the things that I had described in the GitHub dependencies section. But later we may add some more things in here as this project grows. The main directory structure for the project is going to be under source, main, Java, and these are organized in Java packages. So we've got YouTube, that coding guy, dungeon keeper here, and I've got another package called domains, and inside that we've got a rooms package, which contains 2 files. And then we've got in the root of this package, we've got the Dungeon Keeper application. And in source main resources, we've got application YAML. Let's take a look at application YAML real quick. This is going to be where you configure your database stuff. So if you happen to install Postgres on a different port on your machine, you could change the port here, and that's going to help that connect to the right port on your local database instance. And this is the name of the database that we're going to be organizing in Postgres. I've also got my system's Postgres username and password here. If I believe the root is the default when you install. If you had made this something else during your installation, go ahead and change this to whatever your value is on your system. The Postgres username is pretty ubiquitous. So, and then we've got some other configuration here that we don't really need to talk about too much. But I have this set to create drop, and that means that when we start our API server here, it's going to automatically go out to the database, drop everything that's there, and recreate it according to our code here. And that's going to just help us get going and develop very quickly. So that is the application YAML. And then the Dungeon Keeper application itself, we'll actually save that for a second, and we will look at the room class. So this room class, and now that we're actually kind of done with going through the tree a little bit, I will kick this back into regular mode here, exit presentation mode. Cool. So room is my basic class here, and like all classes, this one has a couple of properties, and then we have some getters and setters for those properties. We've got the default constructor, that's a no argument constructor, and then we've got a little constructor that just takes the name of the room. So I'm thinking this room class is going to be a basic building block for generating different rooms. Right now they've only got a name. You'll notice here that we've got this annotation up here at entity, and this is a persistence annotation, and this is going to tell the database when we start the server, hey, I need a table to handle these room classes. So go ahead and make a table for me. And that table is going to have an ID field. It's annotated as our ID, so this is going to be our primary key in the database. And the generated value strategy here of identity just means that we're going to let the database auto number those rooms for us. So whenever we create a new one, it's going to automatically generate the next ID and use that as the next key. So we've also got a room repository. Now this is an interface. It's annotated as @repository, and repositories are basically responsible for being the intermediary between our API and the database. They know how to talk to the database, they know how to query the database, and we're going to be using this repository for those database operations. Now this room repository extends CRUD repository, and if you don't know what this means, that's fine, but the crux of it is that this room repository and CRUD repository, it knows about our class. It knows about our room class. So it's going to be able to interact with the database and query that table. And these repositories, because we're using Spring Framework, Spring Data, these are going to have a lot of functionality for free, and we'll see more about that a little bit later. The Dungeon Keeper application itself is our main class for this program, and that's why it's kind of hanging out in the root of our Dungeon Keeper package. And as you can see, it is annotated as a SpringBoot application, and that's just going to tell Spring, hey, this is our main class. It really sets up some auto configuration for us and things like that. Now, this Dungeon Keeper application class has a main method. If you're familiar with Java, you know that Java programs have a main method. It's the entry point of the application. And this is just a bit of boilerplate code. It's saying, hey, when I press the start button here, Spring, I want you to run this Dungeon Keeper application class. And I've also got a bean here, and we are specifying the command line runner. This little method demo is going to save a new room class, and we're calling on the room repository to save that for us. So basically, room repository, it knows how to write the query to insert this new room into the database. And so it's writing that query under the hood, it's connecting to the database for us, and it is having the database run that query, and this guy handles the results of that. So command line runner here, I'm just using this as a way to run this code quickly as soon as our server starts up. So command line runner, this is not necessary for our server to start up, but this is basically a little lifecycle hook where I want to run this piece of code as soon as the server is up and everything is good. Hey, just go save this new room to the this abandoned barracks room to the database. And that just, it's going to help us quickly. This is also for folks who are new to this. If this doesn't work for some reason, it's actually going to test out your database installation and make sure that the database is there and it's ready to rock and roll for you. So to start up this server, you can click either one of these play buttons, and I'll go ahead and do that now and run my Dungeon Keeper application. And we can see a bunch of stuff in the logs here. Lots of stuff going on. And at the end of it, we've got started Dungeon Keeper application. And this is running on port 8080, which is the default port for a SpringBoot application. If you need to run this on another port for some reason, you can definitely do that. If you want to Google up the server configuration, basically it would go in here and you could set whatever port you need to for any reason. But 8080 is a very typical default API port, and I've got nothing else running on that port, so this is just fine. And because we have, in this application YAML, because we have show SQL set to true, we can see that we're printing some of these hibernate commands. Now, hibernate is the object relational mapper, or ORM, that is helping the Spring Framework interact with our database. And so this is printing out the SQL that was actually generated and run. If you recall earlier, I said whenever our server starts, because we have create drop specified, we're dropping everything that's currently in the database. So that you can see that right here. After Spring went through and verified a lot of things and started up some things, it started running that query or that command to drop the table if it exists. That's the room table, and it's recreating that. And then you can see this hibernate insert into room name values. That is the command line runner kicking off. Remember I said that if everything else is good, the first thing that the server is going to do once it's up is run that piece of code here in the command line runner. That's basically what command line runner does. And so this is the SQL that was generated by the room repository.save here. Lots of stuff going on if you're not familiar with this. So it's definitely okay to be confused. It's definitely okay not to understand everything I just said. What I like to say is you don't have to know how your car works. You don't have to know anything about fuel injection in order to start it up and drive it to the store. And that's how I like to approach these APIs. You know, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes for us here, thanks to the Spring framework and all this other technology that we're using. But the reason these frameworks were created is to abstract all of that technology away and leave developers to not have to worry about all that stuff and the intricate details of what's going on, but just free us up from that in order to write business application logic. So we don't have to know how all that works under the hood, honestly, for the most part, especially just getting started here. Now, because this did start up and insert into our database, what we can do is pull up pgadmin and verify that that room got inserted. So I'll bring over my pgadmin here, and what I've done is gone into my Postgres server under databases. I've got Dungeon Keeper here, and that's because we had the specification here in the application YAML that we have localhost 5432. That's our database server, and this is the name of the database that we specified. So that's getting created and dropped. And if we come in to pgadmin under our Dungeon Keeper, we can open up schemas, open up public, come into tables, and you'll see I've got room here. And when I view edit data all rows, that basically runs this little query for us to select star from public.room. And we can see we've got one entry here with abandoned barracks. Now, if I had wanted to do another one, we could come into Dungeon Keeper application. I'm going to use Control D to duplicate this line, and we could have a treasure room here. If I save that and rerun my application, we can see a second hibernate insert here now. And if we come back over here and probably start with refreshing the schema, we can come in and view all rows again. And now I've got a second one that has been inserted. So, and because we had over here in the room class, it's specified as an entity, and we had the ID and the generated value here. That's why this automatically got set to 2. You know, we didn't have to specify over here in this the Dungeon Keeper application here, we didn't have to specify the key or the ID of these objects. We let the database handle that for us. So If you happen to press start and you got some sort of error here, double check that you've got all of the dependencies installed correctly. And generally there will be some problems here or some text here, some stack traces that tell you what the problem is. They can be pretty confusing sometimes. Sometimes they're pretty good. A common one that I would see would be if you had the password here set to something different than you had installed. And if we run this in that configuration, I would get the stack trace here, and it's telling me, you know, hey, fatal password authentication failed for user Postgres. So that's because I had set mine as root when I installed Postgres. But you'll see, you know, there's lots of stuff here in these stack traces. You kind of want to scroll up to some parts where they start looking different, and some of these guys will be clues that you can use to hunt down on Stack Overflow. Throw them into Google and things like that, and it might help you find your answer, would be my recommendation there. Cool. Stay tuned, and we'll delve more into this Dungeon Keeper application. Cheers.